The dust was the first thing. It coated everything: the porch rails, the single rocking chair, the panes of glass so grimy the light filtered through like a perpetual twilight. Elara stepped down from the stagecoach, her satin slippers sinking into the dry earth, the expensive silk of her traveling dress feeling grotesquely out of place. The wind, sharp and unforgiving, whipped strands of hair from her bonnet and stung her eyes, carrying the scent of dry grass and something wild, untamed. This was the Half Moon Ranch, her inheritance. Half of it, at least. The other half belonged to Silas Blackwood, a man she had never met, but whose name had been spoken by the lawyer with a sort of grim caution, a footnote to the unexpected will that had pulled her from the ordered, predictable life she had known. Her father, a man mostly absent from her life, had left her this desolate stretch of land, half a partnership with a stranger, instead of the quiet annuity she had anticipated. She stood alone, the stagecoach rumbling away, leaving her isolated with the vast, indifferent landscapes stretching to the horizon. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her initial shock. She was utterly alone, miles from civilization, with only a trunk of clothes and a fragile letter explaining her father's final wishes. And Silas Blackwood. The lawyer's words echoed. He is a man of the land, private, resentful of outside intrusion. That was her. An unwanted daughter claiming a share of a life her father had built far from her. The house stood silent and weathered, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It looked less like a home and more like a structure clinging desperately to existence against the elements. A barn sagged in the distance. There was no sign of life, save for the wind and the buzz of flies. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Elara clutched her reticule like a shield and walked towards the house. The door creaked open under her tentative touch, revealing a dusty, sparsely furnished interior. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth cold and empty. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of disuse. Upstairs, a single bedroom held a narrow cot and a chest of drawers. It was nothing like the comfortable, if modest, home she had left behind. This was survival, stark and unvarnished. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. What was she to do? She knew nothing of ranches, of cattle, of this harsh land. Her skills lay in needlepoint piano, managing a small household budget useless here. A sound from outside startled her. A heavy tread, approaching the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Silas Blackwood. She had imagined him perhaps an older man, weathered and gruff, but perhaps with a flicker of weary acceptance. The reality was worse. He filled the doorway, blocking the meager light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn leather and denim, smelling faintly of horse and dust. His face was hard, etched with sun and something else, resentment, raw and undisguised. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, fixed on her, and the expression in them was pure, unadulterated contempt. There was no greeting, no flicker of curiosity, only the heavy weight of his disapproval. He looked at her as if she were a snake that had just slithered onto his porch. "You," he said, the word a low growl. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. His gaze swept over her, lingering on her inappropriate attire, her trembling hands. The fear she knew was plain on her face. She felt stripped bare, exposed. "You're the one." Elara found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Mr. Blackwood? I am Elara Ainsworth. My father was Thomas Ainsworth. I believe you received word." "Word enough," he spat, stepping fully into the room. His presence was immense, dominating the small space. Word that Thomas's interference didn't end with his dying breath. "He saddles me with this," he gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the land, her very being. A city woman. On the Half Moon, the scorn in his voice was a physical blow. "It is also my inheritance," she said, trying to stand taller, to inject a firmness she didn't feel into her voice. "Half of it. The will is quite clear." "The will is a damn nuisance," he retorted, running a hand through his dark, unkempt hair. "This ranch needs work, not delicate hands playing lady. What do you know of running cattle? Of mending fence? Of surviving when the snow bites or the river floods? She swallowed, unable to answer. He was right. She knew nothing. The weight of her inadequacy pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Nothing, he answered for her, his voice dripping with finality. You know nothing. He should have left you money, not land. This land breaks people like you. And what do you propose I do, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, her voice regaining a sliver of defiance born of desperation. Walk away? Leave my inheritance? That would be the sensible thing, he said, his eyes narrowing. This place ain't for you. It ain't a place for soft hands or fragile nerves. It's hard. It's cruel. And right now it's struggling. We're struggling. The last words were quieter, weighted with a different kind of burden, a grim acceptance of hardship. The lawyer said, There are debts, she ventured, remembering another detail from the letter. Her father's affairs, apparently, were not as tidy as his sudden death had revealed. He barked a short, bitter laugh. Debts? We're neck deep. Been fighting it for years. Thomas. Well, he wasn't the sharpest when it came to the books. He ran up credit against the land, against the herd. And now it's my problem. Our problem, I suppose, seeing as you're here, the emphasis on our was laced with venom. Then perhaps we must work together, she said, the idea forming tentatively, fragilely, in her mind. It was the only logical conclusion, the only path forward that didn't involve immediate, humiliating retreat. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken animosity and the vastness of the task ahead. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but colder than any insult. You think you can work? You think you can earn your keep here? This ain't a parlor game. This is dirt and sweat and broken bones. This is fighting for every scrap you get. I am willing to learn, she said, her resolve hardening slightly under the relentless pressure of his gaze. She wouldn't be chased away immediately, not without trying. Her father's ranch, her half of it. It was the only tangible connection she had left to him, distant as he had been. He looked away, out the window at the sun-bleached land. Learn, he repeated, a low, humorless chuckle escaping him. All right, city girl, let's see what you're made of. But don't think this means anything. You're here. You're part of the problem now. We'll see if you can be part of the solution, or if you just wither away like a transplanted flower. He turned back to her, his gaze hard again. Don't expect pretty words or easy tasks. Expect work. Hard work. Starting now, he gestured towards the door. The horses need watering. The well's yonder. He didn't wait for a response. Simply turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the dusty room. The weight of his hatred and the impossible reality of her situation pressing down on her. The vast, empty land outside suddenly felt less like an inheritance and more like a prison. But there was a flicker of something else too. A stubborn refusal to let him see her break. Not yet. Not on the first day. The days that followed were a blur of aching muscles, scraped hands, and a constant, gnawing exhaustion that settled deep into her bones. Silas made good on his promise of hard labor. He seemed to invent tasks specifically designed to highlight her inadequacy and break her spirit. Hauling water from the well, the bucket heavy and awkward, sloshing onto her worn shoes. Mucking out the stable, the smell overpowering, the fork unwieldy in her soft hands. Trying to chop wood, the axe head refusing to bite into the tough logs, her swings weak and inaccurate. He watched her, silent and impassive, his expression giving away nothing but a confirmation of his initial assessment. He rarely offered instruction, only curt commands or a derisive glance when she fumbled. Elara quickly shed the remnants of her city wardrobe, trading her fine fabrics for rough homespun skirts and blouses she found in a dusty trunk, likely belonging to her father's previous housekeeper, if he'd ever had one. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning her skin despite her bonnet. Her hands, once smooth and soft, became calloused and rough, dotted with blisters. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest by the end of the day. At night, she collapsed onto the narrow cot, too tired to even fully undress, the scent of dust and horse manure clinging to her. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the howl of coyotes, the wind rattling the window panes. Mealtimes were silent affairs. They ate together out of necessity, sharing simple, often bland food: beans, salt pork, sourdough bread. Silas ate quickly, his gaze fixed on his plate or out the window. He spoke only to issue instructions for the following day or to point out something that needed doing. Alara, initially intimidated, began to observe him. She watched the economy of his movements, the quiet competence with which he handled tools, rode a horse, assessed the herd from a distance. He was a part of this land, molded by it as much as the rocks and the trees. There was a stark beauty to his self-sufficiency, a quiet strength she hadn't initially perceived through the veil of his hostility. She also observed the land itself. It was unforgiving, but also held moments of stark beauty. Sunrises painted the sky in fiery hues, vast and uninterrupted. The air in the early morning was crisp and clean. The distant mountains held a majestic, immutable presence. The cattle, though fewer than they should be, were resilient, grazing on the sparse grass. She began to see not just the hardship, but the potential, the fragile life clinging to the earth. One afternoon, Silas found her attempting to mend a section of fence near the house. She had watched him do it once, the hammer blows sure and rhythmic, the wire stretched taut. Her own efforts were clumsy. The wire kept slipping, the staples bent under her inaccurate strikes. She was sweating, frustrated, her hands aching. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. His usual expression of contempt was there, but perhaps with a hint of something else: impatience, begrudging curiosity. "You're bending the staples," he said finally, his voice flat. Alara flinched, expecting the usual derision. I can't get them to go straight." He sighed, a sound of long-suffering weariness. "You have to hit them flush." Not at an angle. He walked closer, took the hammer from her hand without a word. He placed a staple against the post, held it with calloused fingers, and struck it with one swift, clean blow. The staple bit cleanly into the wood, holding the wire firm. He did another and then another, the movements efficient and practiced. "Like this. And don't try to do too many at once. Get one good, then move on." He handed the hammer back to her. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. His skin was rough, warm from the sun. It was the first time he had offered anything resembling instruction, the first time he had physically shown her how to do something instead of just telling her she was doing it wrong. "Thank you," she murmured, surprised by the quiet gratitude she felt. He didn't respond, just watched her as she tried again, focusing on hitting the staple flush. The first few still went in crookedly, but gradually, painstakingly, she started to get the feel of it. It was slow, laborious work, but she felt a small spark of satisfaction each time a staple held firm, each time the fence tightened a little. Silas stayed there for a while, not speaking, not helping, just watching. His presence was still intimidating, but it felt different. Less actively hostile, more watchful, like someone observing a strange creature attempting to navigate an alien environment. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Alara sat on the porch steps, rubbing her aching hands. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. He saw her and paused. Instead of going inside, he walked towards the other rocking chair on the porch and sat down, the wood creaking softly. The silence stretched between them, not entirely comfortable, but lacking the sharp edge it had held just days before. "It's hard, isn't it?" he said finally, his voice low. Alara looked at him, surprised by the unexpected acknowledgement. "Yes, it is." He nodded, looking out at the darkening land. "It doesn't get much easier. You just get tougher." "You seem to be," she said, a quiet statement of fact. He gave a small, non-committal shrug. Been doing it a long time. Since I was a boy, he paused. Thomas. He wasn't built for this, not really. He had the idea for the ranch, the vision, but the day-to-day. The grind. He left a lot of that to others. To me, eventually. This was more than he had ever volunteered about her father, or about himself. You worked for him? She asked gently. Worked with him, he corrected, his voice regaining a hint of bitterness. He needed a partner, someone who knew the land, knew cattle. My family, we'd been here generations, just small holdings. He had the money, I had the know-how. We went into partnership. Half Moon, his idea, split down the middle, 50-50, his gaze hardened. He swore up and down I'd get his share eventually, said I was the only one who could keep it going. Then he up and dies and leaves half to a stranger. Elara felt a pang of understanding, and something akin to pity, for the first time towards him. He felt betrayed. Her father had promised him the ranch, built it with him, and then, in death, divided it again, giving half to a daughter he barely knew. No wonder he resented her. She was the symbol of her father's final, perceived betrayal. I didn't know, she said softly. He didn't speak of the ranch often. Not to me. He didn't speak of much at all. Towards the end, their relationship had been distant, formal, punctuated by brief, awkward visits. He changed, Silas said, his voice distant, reflective. Used to have fire in him. Then, something went out. He just withdrew. Left everything to slide. That explained the debts, the neglect she saw everywhere. The silence returned, weighted now with this shared knowledge of her father's decline, of the different ways he had disappointed them both. The sun had set completely, and the stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the vast canvas of the night sky, more numerous and brighter than she had ever seen them in the city. They were a cold, distant beauty, but they were also constant, anchoring. Perhaps, she thought, like this land. Hard, yes, but enduring. And perhaps, if she could endure, she could find her place here too. The first crisis came with unexpected ferocity. A late spring blizzard swept in, a blinding white wall that descended without warning. It was early May, and they had already moved the cattle to the higher pastures. The snow was wet and heavy, quickly burying the sparse grass and posing a deadly threat to the herd, especially the new calves. Silas was instantly alert, his usual stoicism replaced by a focused urgency that crackled in the air. The cattle, he barked, pulling on heavy coats and gloves. They'll drift with the wind, get buried in drifts or tangled in the gullies. We have to ride out. Elara stared out the window at the swirling snow, her stomach clenching with fear. She had never ridden in such conditions. The wind howled, shaking the house. Ride out? In this? We lose the herd. We lose everything, he snapped, his eyes hard with determination. There's no choice. Can you ride? She nodded, though her riding experience was limited to gentle canters in city parks. I can ride. Then get your warmest clothes on. He didn't wait for her, grabbing ropes and blankets from the barn. Bundling herself in every available layer, Elara followed him out into the maelstrom. The snow was already knee-deep in places, the wind biting through her clothing. Silas had saddled 2 horses, sturdy ranch geldings. He mounted his with practiced ease, the horse restless in the storm. Stay close to me, he shouted over the wind. Don't lose sight of me. If you get separated, find shelter and wait. Mounting her own horse, Elara gripped the reins tightly, her knuckles white. The snow stung her face, the wind tore at her clothes. Riding was difficult, visibility was poor, and the ground beneath the snow was treacherous. They rode for what felt like hours, leaning into the wind, searching for the scattered herd. Silas seemed to possess an innate sense of direction, navigating the swirling snow as if he could feel the land beneath him. They found the first group huddled miserably in a small copse of trees, shivering and covered in snow. Silas dismounted, moving among them, assessing their condition. He coaxed them gently, trying to turn them towards the shelter of a lower canyon he knew. Elara watched, amazed by the contrast between his rough exterior and the quiet patience he showed towards the animals. He seemed to understand them, their fear, their instincts. As they worked to gather the scattered groups, the wind intensified, and the snow fell even harder. At one point, Alara's horse stumbled on uneven ground, throwing her off balance. She cried out, tumbling into a deep drift. The cold was immediate and shocking. Her horse, startled, bolted for a moment before Silas, reacting instantly, caught its reins. He dismounted quickly, wading through the snow towards her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern, the first time she had heard that tone directed at her. "No," she gasped, struggling to sit up, her clothes soaked, the cold seeping into her bones. "Just cold." He reached down, offering a hand. His grip was strong, pulling her efficiently from the drift. "You have to be more careful. This ain't a place for falls." He didn't help her remount, but he held her horse steady, watching her as she scrambled back into the saddle, shivering uncontrollably. The moment of concern was fleeting, replaced by the urgency of the situation. They rode on, finding more groups of cattle, herding them slowly and painstakingly towards lower ground. It was exhausting, brutal work. Her body ached, her face was numb from the cold, her fingers stiff inside her gloves. But as she pushed herself, battling the wind and the snow, a different feeling began to emerge alongside the fear. A sense of purpose, a grim determination. She was not just surviving, she was contributing. She was part of this effort, fighting alongside Silas to save the herd, to save the ranch. The shared struggle, the sheer physical effort, created a silent bond between them, a recognition of mutual dependence in the face of the elements. There was no time for resentment, only the immediate, pressing need to work together. They reached the lower canyon just as dusk began to fall, the light failing rapidly in the thick snow. The cattle were huddled together, finding some shelter from the worst of the wind. They had managed to save the majority of the herd, though Silas looked worried about some of the younger calves. They were both soaked, freezing, and utterly spent. "We need to get back," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "Can you make it?" Alara nodded, though she felt she had little strength left. The ride back was agonizing, the cold seeming to bite deeper now that the immediate crisis of the cattle was addressed. They rode in silence, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves and the relentless howl of the wind. When they finally reached the ranch house, stumbling numbly from their horses, the warmth inside felt like a miracle. Silas immediately went to the hearth, shoving dry wood into it. Alara shed her wet clothes, wrapping herself in a blanket by the growing fire. Silas, seeing her shivering, poured her a measure of strong, rough whiskey from a bottle he kept for emergencies. "Drink this," he commanded. "Warm you up." She hesitated, unused to liquor, but the cold was too deep. She took a sip. It burned her throat, but a warmth spread through her chest. She drank more, the potent liquid chasing away some of the chill. Silas sat across from her by the fire, peeling off his wet gloves, his face grim with fatigue and worry. They didn't talk about the storm, about the cattle they had saved, about the shared danger. There was a quiet understanding in the room, a different kind of silence than before, one born not of animosity, but of shared endurance. In the face of the storm, the superficial barriers between them had been temporarily swept away, leaving only two people who had faced down a threat together and survived. The aftermath of the blizzard left the ranch even more vulnerable. Several calves had perished, a hard blow to the already struggling herd. Fences needed extensive repair. The storm had also delayed their spring branding and other essential tasks. The pressure of the debts felt heavier than ever. Silas was quieter than usual, his worry palpable. Alara, though still aching from the physical exertion of the storm, felt a new sense of purpose. She had faced the harshness of the land, had been tested, and hadn't broken. She began to seek out tasks she could handle more effectively, focusing on organization and logistics, areas where Silas, though practical, seemed less inclined. She cleaned and organized the chaotic pantry, inventoried their dwindling supplies, meticulously repaired clothing and tack. She learned to identify the cattle by their markings, remembering their vulnerabilities after the storm. She started keeping records of the herd, tracking births, deaths, and movements. It was small work compared to Silas's daily labors with the cattle, but it was necessary, and she did it with a quiet diligence that surprised even herself. Silas noticed. He didn't comment directly, but she saw his eyes linger on the neat rows of jars in the pantry, the mended bridle hanging ready, the ledger where she recorded the cattle numbers. His gruffness hadn't disappeared entirely, but the sharp edge of contempt had dulled. He still gave curt instructions, but sometimes, just sometimes, his tone lacked the implicit criticism it once held. One evening, as Alara was meticulously patching a saddle blanket by the lamplight, Silas sat nearby, sharpening a knife. The rhythmic scrape of the stone against the metal filled the quiet room. "You're handy," he said, the words abrupt, unexpected. Alara looked up, surprised. "I learned to sew. Growing up. Different kind of sewing," he grunted. But there was no mockery in his voice. Useful. It was high praise, coming from him, and Alara felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. She had earned that small word of acknowledgement through her work, not through her name or her inheritance. They began to fall into a rhythm, a working partnership built on necessity and unspoken respect. Silas handled the bulk of the heavy outdoor work, riding the range, moving cattle, repairing major fence breaks. Alara managed the household, the garden she painstakingly started from seeds she found tucked away, and the myriad of smaller tasks that kept the ranch functioning, fixing tack, organizing supplies, doctoring minor injuries on the animals near the house. They were two halves of a whole, each contributing essential skills that the other lacked. The external threat loomed closer. A letter arrived from the bank, stark and unforgiving. The loan was due. They needed a significant sum of money soon, or the bank would foreclose on the ranch. Silas crumpled the letter in his fist, his face dark with fury and despair. "That bastard," he muttered, referring to her father. "He ran us into the ground." "We can't let them take it," Alara said, her voice firm. The ranch had become more than just an inheritance. It was her home, her fight. "There must be something we can do." "Sell cattle," Silas said grimly. "More than we can afford to. And hope prices are good." "Is there anything else?" she pressed. "Any other assets? Anything my father had?" Silas shook his head. "He put everything into this place, and borrowed against it. There's nothing left but the land and the herd." The news cast a pall over the ranch. The hard work felt even more desperate now, a race against time. Alara saw the weight of the burden on Silas's shoulders. He rode longer hours, worked harder, his worry lines deepening. He was fighting for his home, the life he had built, and the legacy he felt had been stolen from him. And now Alara realized she was fighting for it too. One day, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he approached the house. It was Jedediah Stone, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered theirs to the south. He was a large, imposing man, known for his shrewdness and his ambition to expand his territory. He dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with an appraising, almost predatory look. Silas met him on the porch, his posture tense. Alara emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Stone's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, a flicker of surprise before settling into a calculating stare. "Silas, didn't expect to see a lady here." His tone was smooth, but his eyes held a dismissive curiosity. "She's my partner," Silas said, his voice flat, protective in a way that surprised Alara. "Alara Ainsworth, Thomas Ainsworth's daughter." Stone's eyebrows rose. "Ainsworth? Well now, didn't know old Thomas had a daughter. Comes as a bit of a surprise, his affairs bein' settled like this," he chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Heard things ain't goin' so well over here, Silas." "Bang makin, noise." Silas's jaw tightened. "That's our business, Stone." "Maybe," Stone said, circling slightly, his gaze still taking everything in. But a neighbor's business is often everyone's business. Ain't it? Especially when there's opportunity. I might be in a position to help you out, Silas. Take some of that burden off your hands. Buy a little piece of land. Or maybe the whole kit and caboodle. Given the circumstances, his eyes flickered towards Alara. A clear implication that her presence, her inexperience, was one of the circumstances making the ranch vulnerable. Alara felt a surge of anger. He saw her as a weakness, a reason this ranch was ripe for the taking. The ranch isn't for sale, Silas stated, his voice low and dangerous. Not today, maybe, Stone said with a smirk. But banks get impatient. And a man, even a capable one like you, Silas, can only carry so much weight. Especially when he's got dead weight tied to him. His gaze was fixed on Alara now, openly insulting. Before Alara could even process the insult, Silas moved. It wasn't a lunge, not a full attack, but a swift, menacing step forward, his hand going instinctively to the knife at his belt. The movement was subtle but carried immense threat. Stone recoiled slightly, the smirk faltering. "Get off my land, Stone," Silas said, his voice a low growl, his eyes like chips of ice. "And don't come back." Stone held his gaze for a moment, then seemed to decide better of pushing it. He was alone, and Silas, while outnumbered by Stone's hired hands back at his own ranch, was formidable face to face. All right, Stone said, raising his hands placatingly, though his eyes held malice. "Just making a friendly offer. Things change. Let me know if you reconsider." He backed away slowly, mounted his horse, and rode off, disappearing back into the haze of dust. Silas stood watching until Stone was out of sight, his body still coiled with tension. When he turned back to Alara, the intensity in his eyes hadn't fully dissipated. Alara was shaken, not just by Stone's threat, but by Silas's reaction. He had defended her, without hesitation. He had called her his partner and had stood ready to fight for her against an insult, even though his own resentment towards her was still a palpable thing. "He's a snake," Silas said, the tension easing slightly. "Been wanting this land for years. Borders his property. He smells blood in the water now." "He thinks I'm dead weight," Alara said, the phrase stinging. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He didn't deny it explicitly, didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he said, "He sees what he wants to see. A woman on a ranch she knows nothing about. A weakness he can exploit." He paused. "He doesn't see you getting up before dawn. He doesn't see you working till your hands bleed. He doesn't see you figuring things out. He doesn't see you holding your own." The quiet observation was more impactful than any defense. It was an acknowledgement of her efforts, her resilience, her contribution, from the one person whose opinion mattered most here. "He wants the ranch," Alara stated, looking out in the direction Stone had ridden. "We can't let him have it." Silas nodded, his expression grim. "We won't. We'll find a way." The "we" was no longer forced or sarcastic. It was a simple statement of shared purpose. The external threat had solidified their fragile partnership, welding them together against a common enemy. The days leading up to the bank's deadline were tense and grueling. Silas worked tirelessly, pushing himself and the remaining cattle to the limit. Alara matched his intensity in her own way. She scoured the house, looking for anything of value. She found a small box of her mother's jewelry, kept by her father, beautiful but impractical here. She knew what she had to do. "I can sell this," she told Silas one evening, showing him the trinkets. "In town. It won't be enough for the whole debt, but it might. It might help." Silas looked at the jewelry, then at her. "Your mother's." She nodded. "He kept it." He was silent for a moment. "It's your choice," he said finally, his voice subdued. "But I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," she replied. "We need to save the ranch. This is part of it." It was a tangible link to her past, to a mother she barely remembered, but the future of the Half Moon, their shared future, felt more real, more vital, now. Silas rode into town the next day, taking the jewelry. Alara waited at the ranch, the silence heavy with anticipation. When he returned 2 days later, his face was tired, but there was a flicker of something cautiously hopeful in his eyes. "It helped," he said, handing her a small wad of cash. "More than I thought. Prices were fair. And the bank agreed to extend the deadline, given we made a significant payment and promised more after the fall roundup. It buys us time. Time." It was a reprieve, not a solution, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had faced the threat together, and for now they had held it at bay. The fragile thread of partnership had held. But the reprieve was short-lived. Jedediah Stone wasn't one to give up easily. Weeks later, reports reached them from the edges of their property: missing cattle. Not just strays, but signs of cut fences, tracks leading away from the half-moon lands. Rustling. Stone wasn't just waiting. He was actively trying to cripple them, hoping to make the ranch fail so he could pick up the pieces cheaply. This was a direct threat, and it ignited a cold fury in Silas. This wasn't just about money. It was about his pride, his home, his fight against a man who represented everything he despised: greed and disregard for the unwritten laws of the land. "He thinks he can just take what's ours," Silas growled, his eyes dark. "He thinks we're weak." "He's wrong," Alara said, her own voice firm, a steel she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't the frightened city woman anymore. This land, this struggle had forged something new within her. "We fight back." Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by a grim determination that mirrored her own. "We fight back," he agreed. They began riding the fence lines together, Silas teaching her to read the signs of intrusion, to track footprints, to recognize the subtle ways a fence could be tampered with. It was dangerous work. They knew Stone's men, likely armed, could be anywhere on the perimeter. Alara learned to ride with a rifle slung across her saddle, to scan the horizon constantly, her senses heightened by the ever-present threat. She was no longer a passenger on this journey. She was an active participant in the defense of their home. One sweltering afternoon, while checking a remote section of the southern fence line near Stone's property, they found fresh tracks and a section of wire cut clean through. Silas dismounted, examining the tracks. "They're fresh," he said, his voice low. "Probably just moved some head through." He straightened, scanning the landscape. "They can't be far." Alara's heart hammered, but she remained outwardly calm, her hand instinctively resting on the stock of her rifle. "What do we do?" Silas turned to her. The shared danger, the focused intensity in his eyes, seemed to strip away the last remnants of their initial animosity. There was only a shared purpose, a mutual reliance. "We follow them. We can't let them get away with this." He mounted his horse, and they set off, following the clear tracks of cattle and horses across the dry earth. The sun beat down relentlessly, the air thick with heat and dust. They rode in silence, their senses sharp, listening for any sound, any sign of the rustlers. The tension was a palpable thing between them, a coil of shared adrenaline. They tracked the rustlers for miles, across the plains and into a series of low hills. The tracks led them towards a rocky canyon, a natural funnel. As they approached the entrance, Silas held up a hand, stopping. He dismounted, moving silently towards the canyon mouth, peering around the rock face. Alara dismounted beside him, her rifle ready. He motioned for her to stay low. She crept closer, peering cautiously around the rock. Inside the canyon, perhaps 100 yards away, were several figures on horseback, herding a small group of cattle, half-moon cattle. She recognized the markings. There were 3 men, rough-looking, armed. One of them looked familiar, a man she had seen with Stone. Silas edged back, his face grim. 3 of them, armed. Can we take them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas hesitated. He was a skilled shot, capable, but 3 against 2, especially when they had the element of surprise, was dangerous. He looked at Alara, at her determined expression, the rifle steady in her hands. He saw not the frightened city girl, but the resilient woman she had become. "Maybe," he said, his voice low, If we're smart, we need to cut off their retreat. And maybe spook the cattle. Scatter them. They formulated a quick, whispered plan. Alara would circle around to the far end of the canyon, find a vantage point above, and wait for Silas's signal. He would approach the canyon mouth, drawing the rustlers' attention, and then use the terrain to his advantage. When he fired, she was to fire too, not at the men if she could avoid it, but into the air or near the cattle, creating chaos. The goal wasn't a shootout if it could be avoided, but to scatter the herd and force the rustlers to abandon them. Fear clawed at Alara's throat, cold and sharp, but she pushed it down. This was it, the climax of their struggle. She nodded, gripping her rifle, and began to creep away, using the cover of the rocks and brush to circle the canyon. It was a difficult climb, her lungs burning in the heat. She reached a point overlooking the canyon floor, hidden behind a cluster of rocks, her heart pounding. She could see the rustlers below, unaware, and she could see Silas, a lone figure moving towards the canyon mouth, rifle in hand. She waited, every nerve ending screaming with tension. Then, a shot echoed through the canyon. Silas. It was followed by shouts from the rustlers. Alara didn't hesitate. Raising her rifle, she aimed above the cattle and fired. The shot cracked through the air, followed by another and another as she emptied the magazine. The sound ricocheted off the canyon walls, amplified, creating a deafening din. Chaos erupted below. The cattle, startled by the gunfire from two directions, panicked, bawling and scattering in all directions. The rustlers, caught off guard by the unexpected flanking fire and the stampeding cattle, were momentarily confused. Silas fired again, strategically not aiming to kill, but to keep them pinned or moving away from the cattle. One of the rustlers went down, hit in the arm. The other two hesitated, caught between trying to gather the panicked cattle and facing fire from unseen positions. With the cattle scattering and one man injured, the risk was too high. "Let's go!" shouted one of the rustlers, abandoning the herd. They gathered their injured companion, scrambling onto their horses and riding hard back the way they came, disappearing from the canyon as quickly as they had entered it. Silence descended, broken only by the distant lowing of scattered cattle. Alara stayed hidden for a moment longer, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. Then she heard Silas calling her name. "Alara, you all right?" "Yes," she called back, relief washing over her. She clambered down from her vantage point, sliding down the rocky slope, bruised and scratched, but unharmed. Silas met her at the bottom of the canyon. He looked assessing, taking in her appearance, his eyes searching hers. "You did good," he said, the words simple but weighted with meaning. "You didn't freeze up." "Neither did you," she managed, a shaky smile touching her lips. They spent the next hour rounding up the scattered cattle, pushing them back towards the ranch. It was slow, tiring work, but they did it together, moving with a quiet efficiency born of their shared experience. The danger had passed, the immediate threat averted. They had faced down Jedediah Stone's men and won. Riding back to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in glorious colors, Alara felt utterly exhausted but also exhilarated. They had saved the cattle. They had defended their land. She looked at Silas, riding beside her. His face was smudged with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his posture. The hard edges of his face seemed softer in the fading light. "We did it," she said, the words quiet in the vastness of the plains. He looked over at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "Yeah," he said, "we did." There was no need for elaborate declarations or effusive thanks. The shared struggle, the mutual reliance in the face of danger, had forged a bond stronger than words. They were partners not just in name but in truth. Reaching the ranch, they unsaddled the horses, moving with the familiar rhythm of people who had worked side by side for a long time. As Alara turned to head towards the house, Silas stopped her. "Alara," he said, his voice low. She turned back. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the bruises and scratches on her arm from her climb. His touch was tentative, unexpected, but held a tenderness that startled her. "You're hurt," he murmured. "Just scratches," she said softly. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. His storm-colored eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw not resentment, not just respect, but something deeper, something that had grown silently in the unforgiving soil of their shared hardship. The animosity was gone, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of their connection. A bond forged in dust and snow and danger. The bank debt remained, and the threat from Stone might return in another form. The ranch was still struggling, the work still hard, the future uncertain. But as Alara stood there, under the vast expanse of the darkening sky, feeling the gentle weight of Silas's touch on her arm, she knew that she was no longer alone. She was not a city woman lost on the plains, not dead weight dragging him down. She was a partner. She was a rancher. This was her home, and she had helped save it, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had once hated her, finding strength and belonging in the very place she had feared would break her. The land was harsh, yes, but it was also beautiful, resilient, and capable of nurturing a connection she had never expected. A quiet hope rising like the stars beginning to fill the night sky. The fight wasn't over, but they would face it together.